right, so today we're going deep, really deep, into some fascinating spiritual insights.
Buckle up.
Yeah, we're talking about Elder Michael Johnson,
Okay.
pastor, master Hebraist,
Right.
and he's got a really unique take on the rib, from the Bible.
Right.
And we've got some great material to dig into.
Dude, weigh on me.
His book, The Rib of God, a Spiritual Token.
Interesting title.
And a YouTube teaching he did that goes along with it.
Okay, so we're going to, see how he puts all this together.
Exactly. We're going to unpack what he's saying, like what's the big deal about the rib.
Right. I'm intrigued. I mean, it's just a rib, right? What's the spiritual significance?
Well, that's the thing. He sees it as way more than just like a bone.
Okay.
It's like this whole key to understanding the covenant.
The covenant between
Jehovah and his people.
Ah, okay. Now that's interesting. So where do we start with this?
Well, right off the bat, Elder Johnson contrasts Adam and Jacob.
Like how they relate to God.
Exactly. Two totally different ways of seeking Jehovah's presence.
Gotcha.
So it really makes you think about how you approach your faith.
Makes sense. You got to be intentional, right?
Totally. So let's start with Adam. Elder Johnson points out he was kind of passive.
Passive.
Yeah, he didn't really actively go after Jehovah's guidance.
Or blessings or anything like that.
Right, he just kind of expected things to work out on their own.
Interesting. And what does Elder Johnson say about that?
Well, he says Adam never asked for bread or raiment.
Okay, but he means those symbolically, right?
Totally. He's using his Hebraist understanding.
So, like, deeper meaning.
Yeah, bread represents spiritual wisdom, knowledge.
And raiment.
Spiritual protection, covering.
I see. So Adam wasn't really seeking that spiritual sustenance.
Exactly. It's like he missed a huge opportunity.
But what about that part where Jehovah offers his spirit?
Oh, yeah. In Genesis chapter 2, verse 18, Elder Johnson really emphasizes this.
What does he say about it?
Well, Adam turns away from Jehovah's spirit.
Wow, that's a big deal.
Huge. And Elder Johnson says this left Adam spiritually naked.
Spiritually naked?
Yeah, like in Genesis chapter 2, verse 25.
Okay, so not physically naked, but...
Vulnerable, exposed, spiritually speaking.
Right, without that divine covering.
And then, of course, we see the fallout.
Hiding from God.
Blaming Eve.
Classic. Genesis chapter 3, verse 12.
It's like he refuses to take responsibility.
And that sets a pattern, doesn't it?
Yeah, Elder Johnson says this is how separation from Jehovah starts.
That makes sense.
Now, Jacob, total opposite, he's all about pursuing God's blessing.
Like actively going after it.
Right, like his covenant at Bethel, Genesis chapter 28, verses 20 through 21.
Remind me what happened there.
He makes a vow to follow Jehovah.
If what?
If Jehovah guides him and provides.
It's a conditional promise, but still, it shows initiative.
Exactly. Then, of course, the wrestling match. Genesis chapter 32, verses 24 through 30.
Classic Jacob.
He wouldn't give up until he got a blessing.
He wrestled with
an angel.
Intense.
So persistent.
Elder Johnson must love this story.
Oh, he does. He says it's the perfect picture of spiritual determination.
You know, we don't often see that kind of tenacity in our faith, do we?
We should. I mean, look what Jacob got for his efforts.
You got a new name, right?
Israel.
Genesis chapter 32, verse 28.
He became the father of the 12 tribes.
And a covenant bearer.
Elder Johnson even connects this to Proverbs chapter 8, verse 17.
Which says,
Jehovah loves those who diligently seek him.
Okay, so active seeking leads to rewards.
Blessings, promises fulfilled.
It's not just about sitting back and waiting for it to happen.
Right, it's that active seeking that Elder Johnson's getting at.
Like Matthew chapter 7, verse 7.
Ask, and it shall be given.
You've got to be engaged.
Jehovah offers his spirit, but we have to be open to receiving it.
So it's not just about believing, it's about acting on that belief.
Right. Like, what does a heart that seeks look like?
That's a good question.
Elder Johnson says it's a spirit that makes promises.
Okay, like Jacob at Bethel.
A life that follows Jehovah's teachings.
Someone who actually walks the walk.
Unwavering faith, asking for wisdom.
And just committed to Jehovah's way, right?
100%. So now he gets to the big symbol, the rib.
Okay, the rib is a
spiritual token.
Spiritual token. What's that exactly?
So before we jump into the rib specifically, we got to understand how Elder Johnson sees tokens, in biblical law.
Right. He's coming at this from his understanding of Paleo Hebrew.
Exactly. So he says tokens are like visible signs.
Visible signs of...
invisible covenants.
Okay.
They're physical things that represent spiritual realities.
Okay, I'm starting to see where this is going.
And they're reminders of Jehovah's commitments, promises.
Do you have any examples?
Oh yeah, like the rainbow after the flood.
Ah, right. In Genesis chapter 9, verse 13.
Or circumcision, Genesis chapter 17, verse 11.
Those are like physical acts or symbols, but with this whole deeper spiritual meaning.
Right, and Elder Johnson says the rib is like that, but even more so.
Okay, how so?
Well, first think about how it was taken from Adam. Genesis chapter 2, verse 21.
While he was sleeping.
Deep sleep, the Bible says.
Like unconscious. So God's doing the work here.
Right, and then it's transformed into the woman.
So there's this separation from Adam, but also creation of something new.
And Elder Johnson, with his Hebraist background, he sees this as both a parable and a similitude.
Okay, I always get those mixed up.
Parable is like a story with a spiritual lesson.
And a similitude.
It's like a direct comparison to illustrate something deeper.
Got it. So the rib is both of those things.
Exactly. And one of the big things Elder Johnson highlights is this idea of unity.
Unity.
Yeah, like marital unity being part of God's design.
Okay.
And the rib token is foundational to that.
Where does he get that from?
Well, he points to Genesis chapter 2, verses 21 through 24, where Adam says, bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh.
Oh, yeah.
Elder Johnson says that's not just a statement of recognition, it's a declaration of unity.
They are literally made from the same stuff.
Exactly. And then, of course, the idea of becoming one flesh.
Right, that's not just about physical union.
No, it's a deep spiritual and physical bond mirroring the covenant between Jehovah and his people.
So marriage is like a picture of that covenant.
Precisely. Elder Johnson also points back to Genesis chapter 1, verse 27.
Creation.
And Genesis chapter 5, verse 2.
What's that one?
It's where both male and female are called Adam.
Collectively.
Yeah. So even though they have different roles,
There's this fundamental oneness.
oneness in purpose, essence, design.
It's like God created them as a unit right from the beginning.
That was the plan all along. And then, get this, he compares the rib to a wedding ring.
Oh, I like this.
It's so relatable, right?
Yeah, everyone understands a wedding ring.
So Elder Johnson says the rib, it's like this physical reminder of a spiritual covenant.
Like a token of.
Exclusivity, faithfulness.
Makes sense?
And it symbolizes that completed unity.
Two becoming one.
Now, Elder Johnson gets really into the physicality of the rib.
Okay.
He calls it the spiritual architecture of the rib.
Spiritual architecture.
Yeah, he looks at the actual physical properties of the rib to reveal these deeper spiritual truths.
So like what the rib does in the body.
Right. So first of all, the rib cage protects vital organs.
Like the heart.
And for Hebraists, the heart is like the center of intellect and will.
Not just emotion.
Right. So it's this idea of safeguarding what's most precious.
In a relationship, you got to protect each other's hearts.
Then there's the location. The ribs are at the side,
Side by side.
not the head or the feet.
So not above or below.
Equality, partnership.
Makes you think of 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 11 and 12.
That's exactly what Elder Johnson connects it to.
Divine balance, interdependence.
Right. And then there's the fact that ribs are connected to breathing life support.
Essential. Can't live without them.
And the rib cage forms a protective cage.
Protecting vulnerability.
So there's this need for security, care, support within the covenant.
Okay, I'm seeing how he's building this picture.
And then he brings it back to the husband's responsibility
To protect.
his wife, physically, but also spiritually.
That's huge.
He even quotes Psalm chapter 91, verse 4, talking about Jehovah being the ultimate protector.
A covenant of spiritual safeguarding.
So we've got the rib as this symbol of unity, protection.
Now, where does the vessel of life thing come in?
Okay, so now Elder Johnson takes it further.
And this is where it gets really interesting.
He talks about how the rib is transformed.
Transformed.
It starts as this, lifeless bone.
Right.
But then it becomes living flesh.
Through the power of God.
And he says, this is a picture of a spiritual principle, which is that something dead can be brought to life.
Through divine power. Resurrection.
Renewal, rebirth.
And that leads to this idea of spiritual vessels, right?
Exactly, like 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 7.
We have this treasure in earthen vessels.
We're the vessels, and we hold Jehovah's Spirit.
So the woman, formed from the rib, she's like a vessel for physical life.
And the church.
We're vessels for bearing spiritual fruit.
It's this beautiful picture of how God uses things to carry and produce life.
both physically and spiritually.
And then Elder Johnson makes this amazing connection to John chapter 1, verse 14.
The Word became flesh,
He sees a parallel between the rib becoming flesh,
and salvation of Jehovah taking on human form.
like in Philippians chapter 2, verse 7.
So both are manifestations of spirit in the physical realm,
The rib made Adam's essence visible.
and salvation of Jehovah embodied the divine,
It's like bridging the gap between those two realms,
like in Romans chapter 1, verse 20.
where it talks about seeing God's invisible attributes through creation. This idea of bridging is so important.
How so?
Well, the rib takes Adam's solitude and creates companionship,
Right.
just like God's spirit works through creation.
We see his handiwork everywhere,
And Elder Johnson sees Jehovah's servants as vessels too.
fulfilling his will.
It's that harmony between spiritual calling and physical existence.
It's all connected.
Now, Elder Johnson takes this vessel idea even further.
Further.
He brings in the heart transplant from Ezekiel,
Oh yeah, in Ezekiel chapter 36, verse 26.
the heart of stone replaced with a heart of flesh.
What's the connection there?
Both are transformations,
The rib going from lifeless to living.
and the heart going from hard to receptive.
So it's about our spiritual transformation.
Going from spiritual hardness to sensitivity towards Jehovah.
It's that renewal, that rebirth.
And then he brings in Romans chapter 8,
Specifically,
verses 3 through 13, talking about rejecting the flesh.
embracing the spirit,
Walking according to the Spirit,
that intentional spiritual living.
putting to death the misdeeds of the body.
Overcoming those fleshly desires
And all of that leads to the promise of resurrection.
through the Holy Spirit.
It's a process.
Yeah.
We have to make a conscious effort to turn away from the flesh.
And align ourselves with the Spirit.
And finally, he connects it to the dry bones in Ezekiel,
In Ezekiel chapter 37, verses 3 through 5.
where God breathes life into them.
Just like the rib receiving breath and becoming alive,
It's a powerful picture of spiritual vitality.
that transformation is available to all of us.
Now, in part 4, Elder Johnson gets into a warning.
A warning about what?
He sees the singular nature of the rib as a caution,
A caution again.
spiritual heathenism.
Okay,
And it all comes back to the fact that only one rib was taken
right.
to create one woman.
It wasn't like God took a bunch of ribs and made a bunch of women.
Exactly. And L. Johnson says this sets the blueprint for marriage.
One man, one woman.
It's a sign, a token of exclusivity.
Within the covenant of marriage.
And he says this leads to a warning against polygamy.
Like having multiple wives.
Right. He quotes Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 17.
What does that say?
It cautions kings against multiplying wives because it can lead to a divided heart.
Divided loyalties.
And he says that applies spiritually too.
To our relationship with God.
Like, don't have divided allegiances.
So polygamy is like a rebellion against that principle of singular devotion.
That's what Elder Johnson argues.
It's like a pattern of mixed loyalties.
He even points to kings and priests in Revelation chapter 5, verses 8 through 10.
They're held to a higher standard.
Singular devotion.
So how does this relate to spiritual fidelity?
Well, Elder Johnson draws a parallel to Israel's unfaithfulness.
When they worshipped other gods.
He calls it spiritual polygamy.
That's a powerful image.
He references Hosea chapter 4, verse 12.
A spirit of whoredoms.
Yeah, that's what leads them astray.
They're pursuing multiple gods, breaking the covenant.
That divided loyalty messes everything up.
Creates confusion.
And then he brings back the wedding ring analogy.
Interesting.
He says not wearing it can be like rejecting the covenant.
Like ignoring those reminders of commitment.
It's like ignoring the rainbow or the fringes from the Old Testament.
All those tokens reminding us to be devoted.
So Elder Johnson is saying we have a choice.
Spiritual monogamy versus spiritual heathenism.
Will you be devoted to salvation of Jehovah alone?
Or will you be pulled in different directions?
Will you resist those fleshly desires?
Embrace the Spirit as your guide.
It's a decision we all have to make.
And Elder Johnson uses the ribs transformation as a model for our own spiritual renewal.
That's powerful.
He finishes this section with 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 17.
The new creation.
The old is gone, everything becomes new.
We go from that stony heart to a heart of flesh.
We become vessels for God's purpose.
Okay, so now Elder Johnson shifts gears a bit.
What does he talk about?
Why the covenant went from Adam to Noah, then to Abraham, Isaac, and finally Jacob.
Why not just stick with Adam?
Yeah, what's with the whole lineage thing?
Good question.
Elder Johnson dives into that, with his Hebraist understanding.
So what's the deal with Adam?
Well, he was the first man, right.
Genesis chapter 1, verse 27.
But then we see the fall in Genesis chapter 3, verse 6.
That's where it all goes wrong.
And then there's this interesting verse in 2nd Esdras.
2nd Esdras chapter 3, verse 21.
It says, Adam had a wicked heart from the beginning.
So, like, humanity was flawed from the start.
And Elder Johnson points out that Adam wasn't deceived.
Like Eve was.
Right? 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 14 says Adam wasn't deceived.
So he knew what he was doing.
He chose to disobey. He gave in to those desires.
Which shows what?
That we need divine intervention.
We can't do it on our own.
And that's why the covenant had to progress beyond Adam.
It had to be refined, narrowed down.
So then we get to Noah.
The flood.
Elder Johnson sees Noah as a universal covenant renewal.
Genesis chapter 7, verse 5.
Noah obeyed God perfectly.
Amidst all the wickedness.
That's why he found favor.
So God makes a covenant with him and all his descendants.
A second chance for creation.
God's giving humanity another shot.
But then it starts to narrow with Abraham.
Genesis chapter 12, verses 2 and 3.
God promises to make him a great nation.
From universal to specific.
It's the shift in the covenant.
And what sets Abraham apart?
His faith. Especially when God asked him to sacrifice Isaac.
That's the ultimate test of faith.
And Abraham passed. That's why he becomes the father of the covenant.
He's the starting point for this special lineage.
And then it narrows even more with Isaac.
Genesis chapter 17, verse 19.
God specifically says the covenant is with Isaac.
The child of promise?
He was born miraculously.
It's like God intervened directly.
Exactly. And that leads us to Jacob.
The culmination.
Romans chapter 9, verses 11 through 13 says he was chosen before he was even born.
Wow.
And then he's renamed Israel after wrestling with the angel.
Genesis chapter 32, verse 28.
He was striving, and he got the blessing.
Ruler with God.
And in Genesis chapter 28, verses 13 and 14, God reaffirms the covenant promises to him.
He becomes the father of the 12 tribes.
The chosen nation.
It's amazing how Elder Johnson traces this whole progression.
It's like a tapestry,
A tapestry of
obedience, faith, divine favor.
God's plan unfolding through these individuals.
From Adam's failure to Jacob's faithfulness.
It's setting the stage for salvation.
Now, in part 6, Elder Johnson talks about the two covenants from flesh to spirit.
Okay.
He contrasts Eve and Israel.
Eve representing
the fleshly covenant.
and Israel.
The spiritual marriage to Jehovah.
So what's the deal with Eve?
Well, think about the rib being taken from Adam.
Genesis chapter 2, verses 21 through 23.
Bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh.
It's physical.
It's an earthly relationship.
But she led to disobedience, right?
That's the downfall.
Right.
It's showing the limitations of a covenant based on the flesh.
We can't rely on ourselves.
Elder Johnson connects this to Romans chapter 7, verse 5.
Talking about how the law arouses sinful passions.
It reveals sin, but it can't redeem us.
Galatians chapter 3, verse 24 makes that clear.
The way of the flesh leads to separation from God.
So Eve represents that struggle, that inability to be righteous on our own.
Now, contrast that with Israel.
The spiritual woman.
Exodus chapter 19, verses 5 and 6.
God calls them his treasured possession.
His bride.
And their bond is based on obedience and holiness.
It's a spiritual marriage.
And it requires transformation.
From flesh to spirit.
Aligning ourselves with God's will.
He even brings in an insight from 2nd Esdras, chapter 1, verses 28 and 29.
2nd Esdras.
It's an apocryphal book, but it talks about Israel's unfaithfulness as spiritual adultery.
Oh, wow.
But it also highlights God's steadfast love.
Despite their failings.
He keeps calling them back.
It shows how the spiritual marriage needs commitment.
From both sides.
So how do we move from flesh to spirit?
That's where salvation of Jehovah comes in.
He bridges that gap.
Romans chapter 7, verse 4 says, we died to the law through the body of salvation of Jehovah.
So we're no longer bound by the flesh.
We belong to him.
It's a new covenant.
The new covenant promise is in Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 31 through 33.
Where God writes his law on our hearts.
Not on stone tablets.
It's that inward transformation.
From external rules to internal guidance.
From Eve to Israel.
Fulfilled in salvation of Jehovah.
And each of us goes through this renewal.
It's a personal journey.
Colossians chapter 3, verse 10 talks about putting on the new self.
We die to the flesh and become alive in the spirit.
We become part of God's spiritual nation.
All right, so in the last part, part 7, Elder Johnson talks about the challenges of living this way,
The challenges of what?
living the spirit-filled life.
It's not always easy.
No, he's honest about that. He quotes Lamentations chapter 2, verses 14 and 15.
What's that about?
False prophets, people distorting the truth.
And those who reject God's truth, they often try to tear down those who are trying to live right.
We see that all the time.
It's a struggle against worldly views.
And persecution too, right?
Oh yeah, 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 12 through 15.
Suffering for righteousness.
It's not a surprise.
It's part of following salvation of Jehovah.
We're sharing in his experience.
And the world often rejects us for it.
Like in Matthew chapter 13, verse 22, where it talks about the cares of the world choking out the word.
So these trials, they're not a detour, they're part of the path.
Exactly. And Elder Johnson comes back to this idea of the rib being a call to action.
A call to.
Align ourselves with God.
He's asking us, will we stay bound to the flesh?
Or will we let God mold us?
Will we cling to the old ways?
Or embrace the new life offered by the Spirit?
It's the same transformation the rib went through.
It's a powerful reminder.
It's about unity, transformation, faith.
Just like the rib completed Adam,
We're completed through spiritual renewal. It's answering God's call.
fulfilling his purpose.
So there you have it. Elder Johnson's take on the rib.
It's way more than just a bone, huh?
It's a symbol of unity, protection, faithfulness.
The blueprint for our spiritual alignment.
He takes something seemingly small and reveals this whole world of meaning.
He's connecting the physical and spiritual in such a fascinating way.
And that brings us to our final question.
Hit me with it.
Will you choose the spirit or the flesh?
Transformation or hardening?
Will you honor that singular covenant?
Will you be a vessel for God's purpose?
It's a choice we all have to make.
This deep dive has been incredible. It's about the journey, from Adam to Jacob,
From a physical understanding to a spiritual one.
from the token to the fulfillment.
The rib has this eternal significance in God's plan.
And Elder Johnson